Welcome, everyone, to Working People and the Real News Network podcast. My name is Maximilian Alvarez. I'm the editor-in-chief here at The Real News, and it's great to have y'all with us. The rural landscape in the United States is changing drastically. The days of the independent family farm have given way to industrial agriculture and factory animal farms. In states around the country, from Iowa and Minnesota to North Carolina, the expansion of big agriculture and the factory farming industry has dramatically altered local economies and communities, using up communal resources while posing serious threats to public health and the environment. Far from halting this trend, governments at the state and federal level have worked with powerful industry groups for years to incentivize large-scale farming operations and to make it increasingly difficult for local governments to adequately regulate those operations. But resistance from within rural communities, stretching across political lines, is mounting. At this very moment, farmers, residents, and environmental advocates in 3 rural counties in Wisconsin, that's Polk, Burnett, and Crawford counties, are engaged in a battle to protect their communities against the construction of 2 proposed concentrated animal feeding operations, also known as CAFOs, which would collectively house roughly 34,000 hogs. Residents fear that the millions upon millions of gallons of liquid manure produced by these CAFOs every year, along with their many other impacts, could cause irreversible damage to their land, air, water, property values, and ways of life. As part of a special collaboration between the Real News Network and In These Times magazine for the Wisconsin Idea, I got to travel with our own Real News cameraman Cameron Granadino and the brilliant Hannah Faris of In These Times to Crawford, Polk, and Burnett counties earlier this summer to speak with residents about their concerns and about their struggles to defend themselves against big agriculture and the factory farming industry. And if you haven't already, you should definitely check out our video reports on this struggle, which we published throughout the summer at The Real News. And we were so honored and grateful to have those reports republished by the amazing folks at In These Times and Free Speech TV, 2 vital media organizations that we highly encourage everyone listening to go support. Now, we're going to be running some of the interviews that we did for that series in audio form on the Working People podcast feed. But before we do that, we wanted to convene this sort of special panel recording with some of the folks who have been involved in these struggles in Polk, Burnett, and Crawford counties, as well as folks at In These Times and Free Speech TV who have helped us collectively bring necessary coverage to this underreported struggle. And we wanted to take this opportunity to give listeners some context for the reporting that we did and also sort of update y'all on where the struggle stands now from the people who are on the front lines of it. And so without further ado, I cannot thank our panelists enough for joining me. And let's go around and introduce everyone to our listeners. So, Forrest, could you start by introducing yourself?
So thanks, Max, for having us on here today and talking about these important issues. So my name is Forrest Yankee. I'm the program coordinator for Crawford Stewardship Project, Crawford County being here in southwest Wisconsin at the convergence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers in the hills and valleys and fractured bedrock of what's called the driftless area. And I was born in a barn and raised here in Crawford County, but it really took me living in Mexico for a few years, traveling through a couple dozen other countries throughout the world, and then coming back here to fully recognize how special and sensitive this area really is, and how blessed we are to have springs bubbling up out of the ground that we can drink straight out of, how abundant and rich our soil is, and how lovely and clean the air is. And so these are things that I try to communicate to local people who might not recognize how blessed we are to have all these things here, and that in much of the world you can't even turn on your tap and get drinkable water. And that's something that we're really dedicated to protecting in this area and making sure that people can turn on their tap and get drinkable water. And we have an abundance of water, and much of it is still clean, but there's lots of threats coming on over the horizon and across the river from Iowa. And we'll talk about all that more. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on and for bringing attention to this issue.
Hi, Max. My name is Lisa Doerr, and I live in Polk County, which is in far northwestern Wisconsin, not quite to Canada. And my husband and I are commercial forage producers here in Polk County. We produce alfalfa and grass forage for cattle and sheep and horses and maybe some rabbits once in a while. I'm not really sure. But I became active in the CAFO issue, the concentrated animal feeding operation issue, the large animal factories, when word got out that this big company was trying to build a 26,000 hog operation north of us here. And that's a facility that is trying to get permits right now. But then they started coming into our neighborhood and asking our local friends if they wanted to sell their land for hog factories. So a friend of mine called and told me that about a mile east of us here, they wanted to buy his land and put in a hog factory. So I'm proud to say that I'm a NIMBY, and I'm going to protect our community from these plans. And I really appreciate being on the show today.
Hi again, Max. I'm Hannah Faris. I am an editor for the Wisconsin Idea, which is a reporting project run by In These Times and Wisconsin Citizen Action. I am also born and raised in northwestern Wisconsin in a town called Chippewa Falls, about an hour from Polk County. And I really appreciate you, the team at Real News, pursuing this project and having us on today to talk more about this.
Hi, Max. I'm Maeve Conran. I am the program director at Free Speech TV. We are a national progressive news television network, and we were delighted to be able to partner with the Real News Network and In These Times to be able to broadcast the great documentary and the interviews, as well as do interviews ourselves on this topic. And particularly because we know that we reach many, many rural viewers who don't have access, who are not well served by the media. And we're also very, very conscious of the lack of news reporting, really comprehensive news reporting on rural issues. So being able to share this incredible content produced by Real News Network and In These Times has just been great for us.
Well, thank you all so much again for sitting down and chatting with me, especially with all that you have going on in your respective corners of the world. It's truly been an honor to work with all of you in putting together this important coverage, right? You know, we started at the Real News kind of collaborating on this project after we talked with the great folks at In These Times who had been independently reporting on it. And then that led us to connect with and collaborate with Free Speech TV. So it's really been an incredible honor and very exciting to see that all of us together can produce something that perhaps none of us could have produced on our own, and just really speaks to the importance of collaboration to bring the kind of coverage that working people around the country desperately need. And, you know, again, as I was saying kind of in the introduction, right, we're going to be running the audio versions of some of those interviews that I got to do, including one with Lisa over there in Polk County, when we were there on the ground reporting for the Real News and In These Times back in June. But, you know, we wanted to convene this sort of panel to make sure that everyone who's going to hear those interviews knows like what the terrain looks like and what the kind of background to these struggles is, and also why it's important, why we should all be, you know, caring about this. not just because of, the implications that these animal factories, as Lisa said, have for the communities in Polk, Crawford, and Burnett counties, but also because what the onslaught of big agriculture and the factory farming industry means for all of us in this country and beyond. And so, in the tradition of Working People, where we talk to workers about their lives and their struggles, I wanted to turn things back over to Forrest and Lisa and ask if y'all could, maybe give listeners who may be hearing about this for the first time a bit of a rundown of the CAFO fights in your counties, from the moment that you kind of heard that these facilities were being proposed to when we all met up earlier in the summer to now. I guess, what do you think folks out there need to know about this?
So in Crawford County, Crawford Stewardship Project started up around the first expansion of one of the local farms to CAFO status. So that's over 1,000 animal units, as the jargon goes, which is about 1,500 pigs. They now have about 3,000 sows in that operation. And this was right around the time that Wisconsin passed what's called the livestock sighting law, which really explicitly removed local control from sighting of these operations. And so although there was a lot of public input and concerns and expert analysis saying this was just too many animals on not enough acres, and that it was going to be producing too many nutrients, which was going to build up in the soils and run off into the waters. At the end of the day, the rules being what they were, the operation was approved despite the community opposition and even some opposition from the county at that point. So they've been approved and operating now since 2010. They now have proposed to build a new and expanded facility of about 3 times the size, which would be producing and storing and spreading 9.5 million gallons of manure per year, on top of the 3 million gallons of manure per year that their existing facility produces. This would just be a handful of miles away, and in combination would make them the largest hog CAFO in the state of Wisconsin, in an area that I could make a pretty solid scientific argument is one of the most sensitive areas in the state, both to surface water and groundwater contamination. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this area is really special for a lot of reasons. The Lower Wisconsin State Riverway, just downhill of these operations, was just last year declared as wetlands of international importance. The Lower Kickapoo River, which meets the Wisconsin River right by these operations and is just downslope from the proposed operation, is a conservation opportunity area. This whole area is an important flyway for birds and migratory animals, as well as a real biodiversity hotspot. Really, this region is one of the last remaining biodiversity hotspots in the entire Midwest. And yet, the rules being what they are, and these one-size-fits-all standards being applied to CAFO after CAFO, the DNR has not denied a single CAFO permit in the history of permitting CAFOs in Wisconsin. And we've been told that directly to our faces. So now that there's this new operation proposed, we buckled down again and went to the people on the ground who would be most impacted, who live in that neighborhood, organized them, helped them start up an organization and get connected to networks and resources. We went to the township, got a township CAFO moratorium with a study committee and a report. Unfortunately, the township didn't feel like it had the authority or the resources to do anything. We then went to the county and got a county CAFO moratorium with the county study committee on the issue, which I was a part of in an advisory role, as well as the nutrient management planner for Roth feeder pig, county staff. We put together a 125-page report with concrete steps for action that the county board could take. And once again, the county board declined to do anything whatsoever, despite massive public input and urging action from various local organizations, from Trout Unlimited and some of the hunter-fisher organizations, both local chapters of the Farmers Union and various other environmental and advocacy organizations like Crawford Stewardship Project. So at this point, the ball is in the DNR's court, as usual. And we're a little nervous about it being there because, as I mentioned, they generally just rubber stamp these permits and maybe add a minor condition or two. But we've really been asking for them to hold up to the promise that was made when this new administration came in to return the DNR to science-based decision-making and to focus on clean water. So we're asking them to do an environmental impact statement, do extra research to make sure that this operation would not further contaminate surface or groundwaters or the local air, if not deny it outright.
And just to clarify for listeners, when you say DNR, you're talking about the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, correct?
That's right. And they're the ones who have the explicit permitting authority for these CAFOs, these operations of over 1,000 animal units. The county also has some authority for operations of over 500 animal units, but the county really has extremely limited resources and funding to do any sort of real oversight or regulation. In fact, they don't have a single professional agronomist on the county staff who's really qualified to review these applications. And in the meantime, the DNR is struggling with similar issues of lack of funding, lack of staff. The DNR CAFO permitting program does not actually have a hydrogeologist at the moment, which for obvious reasons is an important factor to consider with these operations, especially when we're talking about this fractured karst bedrock with caves and underground rivers and sinkholes and springs, which are all direct conduits down into the groundwater or into important surface waters.
And, we'll talk a little bit more in a minute, about kind of the scale, right, of industrial agriculture and factory farming operations, right, around the country and even beyond. But I wanted to kind of follow up and Lisa, ask you if you could, give us a rundown of what's been going on in your area. And also, I guess, you did such an amazing job in the video reports that we did, kind of communicating to people like what these CAFOs actually are and what they do. So I was wondering if you could also say a little bit about that as well.
Sure. Thanks so much. Well, in terms of what's going on in our communities, Polk County and Burnett County are relatively rare places because we have a relatively intact agricultural economy. And what I mean by that is a middle class agricultural economy. And we are not dominated by giant corporate agriculture like Iowa, southern Minnesota, a lot of Illinois is. A lot of our guys are producing commodities for the big agricultural giants to send around the world. But we have hundreds of small livestock producers here who raise all kinds of beef and lamb. And we also, what's amazing is we have about a half a dozen family-owned slaughterhouses and processors. So we've got what 50 or 60 years ago, Iowa and other states had, which is a middle class of people producing food. And that's really an extraordinary thing. What's going on now is Iowa and southern Minnesota are so full of virus and other problems. They're just packed full of animal factories that they're looking for new territory. And I'm not making that up. The guys who are trying to develop these hog factories say that point blank in public meetings, that they want to move here because it's clean. And so we have a proposal to build a 26,000 hog factory that would supply the Smithfield processing plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And that's a plant that's owned by the Chinese Communist Party, and it was one of the worst plants for COVID infections. They lost a lot of working people there at that plant. So basically, this factory has found someone to sell them land and have filed for a permit with the county and with the state of Wisconsin. And I think it's really important to point out that these permits that they're talking about only cover the management of the manure. They do not cover the air pollution, which is like hydrogen sulfide and methane and a whole bunch of other horrible things. It also doesn't cover the economic impact on the locals, and it's deeply flawed. So when they talk about a permit, it's really just kind of a joke. So not only did they find someone to sell land in Burnett County, and that factory is moving down the permitting process, they were shopping for land in our area, and none of our people have sold out, and we're kind of excited about that. We've passed moratorium in our county, and they shut down the studies. It's the same game that they're playing in Crawford County. So what we're doing now is working at the very local level. We have about 6 townships that are trying to come together. For sure, we have 2 or 3 of them that are going to come together and pass an ordinance, and we're going to basically, take them on. That's the plan. Because a lot of people ask, well, what are these animal factories? And particularly, we're looking at hog factory development. They are basically trying to build what's called a farrowing plant, and a farrowing plant is where they put thousands of mama pigs together. They're called sows. They live in a box that's 2 foot by 7 foot. They never leave the box. They have their babies there. They nurse their babies till they're about 3 weeks old, and then they take the babies and they take them to what's called a finishing plant, which is also thousands and thousands of hogs in one place. So they never go outside. They live on slatted floors. There's no bedding at all. So they live on a floor that's slatted. And so all of the manure and urine and the placentas, when their babies are born, everything just falls through these slats into a huge manure lagoon that holds millions of gallons of manure. And then twice a year, maybe once a year, depends on the weather, they pipe that manure out as raw liquid manure and either spray it or inject it into the soil and dump it that way. So it's basically totally untreated manure that's spread all over the community. And it's a very vertically integrated industry. It's all owned by a corporation. They have the factory manager build the warehouse to put the animals in, but then the corporation designs the food and takes the babies and raises them up to about 250 pounds, and then they ship them over to a slaughter plant where they process them, and kind of gives you a feel for what's going on. The dairy factories, basically they have thousands of cows that are milked by robots. They go around on a large carousel like a merry-go-round, and then they have people who put on the pumps and pump the milk, and then the cows go out, leave the merry-go-round and go and eat some more. So they basically are never outside ever. And so that's the chicken factories. We're not talking about having those in Wisconsin, but they're very common in the southern states where the chickens again are in tiny little cages. They can barely move around.
Man, yeah, and it's we showed some kind of B-roll footage in our video reporting of these factories, but I'm sure, folks listening, like, you've probably seen, some clips of them. There have been folks who have tried to really expose what these, animal factories look like, but also they're have been a lot of efforts to hide what these animal factories look like, right? And keep the kind of the size and severity of their operations out of public view. And that's something that, we really wanted to address in our reporting, right? Is especially for those of us who don't live in rural areas, right? It's easy to, not know or care about what's going on in the countryside. But as we saw, in driving through the Midwest, right? I mean, these large scale industrial farming operations, not just in factory animal farming, but also in terms of, industrial agriculture with monocrops and stuff like that, right? It's everywhere, or it's almost everywhere, right? It's trying to encroach on even more parts of the country, like Polk and Crawford counties. And Hannah, I wanted to bring you in here to ask if you could talk a little more about your own investigation into this issue and the reporting that y'all were doing in these times. I think it was a piece for the Wisconsin Idea by Simon Davis Cohen that you did the photography for, that we really based a lot of our reporting on, and you have since kind of kept up with this story and reported on what's going on in Crawford too. So I guess, could you talk a little bit about your own investigation into this in these times, and kind of what's really stood out to you as you've investigated this?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, a lot of our dive into this began with a piece written in March of 2021 by Simon Davis Cohen that specifically focused on the CAFO resistance in Polk and Burnett. And as an associate editor at the time, and also being from, an hour from the site of that story, I went to Polk and Burnett to take photos to accompany it, where I met Lisa Christie, who is also in the documentary, and just several members of the community that Lisa so kindly took me around to. And from there, I mean, for one, was so struck by this story, partially because my town, while it is not heavy within agriculture, while it doesn't have a heavy agricultural industry, it is another small town that very much has been taken over by a lot of corporate interests. A couple big plants move in, factories, shipping centers, drain the local economies, essentially eat everything up. So I was struck by how similar these places were. And in conceptualizing kind of how to best continue covering this piece, I thought it was really important to expand it beyond just this one community, because this fight is something that is happening across the state, right? So we looped in Forrest and the team at Crawford Stewardship Project to cover the resistance to rogue feeder pig, as well as some coverage of the dairy CAFOs that are more kind of predominant in eastern Wisconsin, around Green Bay area, specifically Kewaunee County. So following that, Max, Cam, and I went to Wisconsin to make this collaborative project that was both a documentary about this kind of statewide struggle, as well as a written piece that went to print within these times, as well as became its own smaller print issue that we ran in local papers around these affected counties in Wisconsin. That all has to do with the sort of central goal of the Wisconsin Idea, which, as I mentioned, was a project of In These Times and Citizen Action, which was very much created for the purpose of, one, expanding coverage in rural areas on issues that are so extremely important, but are not receiving adequate coverage, whether it be because of the syndication or consolidation of a lot of papers into just kind of a massive network, or just the fact that papers are struggling. They only have maybe a couple editors, a couple reporters. They can't cover everything. Some papers are so dependent on advertising and funding, the advertising and funding of these large farms, that they are not incentivized to cover it, right? So all that is to say, we wanted to tell the story in a way that zoomed out and showed that this is a statewide battle, a statewide, collective effort, as well as getting the sort of nitty gritty of what is going to happen in each community into the hands of those community members.
Maeve, I want to bring you in here in a second to ask about kind of the media coverage angle. But Hannah, you actually brought up something that is really important that we didn't get to cover in the Real News documentary as much as I wanted to. There was just so much kind of information to try to pack into that. But, the media coverage aspect of this is really important, especially when, the majority, like if these issues are covered at all, the vast majority of that coverage is coming from small local publications that are also dependent upon, as you said, the kind of advertising dollars of the same big agricultural interests that have a vested interest in the public not knowing about what they're up to. Lisa, wasn't there something over there in Polk County that like was kind of related to this?
Oh, very directly. One of the institutions behind the attempt to develop hog factories was a big co-op. And in fact, a lot of the agricultural co-ops are driving the development of these large animal factories. So we had a reporter who was doing just a great job on covering the pitched battle. And they actually sent someone into the editor of the newspaper and told him that if they didn't fire that reporter, they would quit advertising. And they actually admitted that in a public hearing. If you ever want to see it, I can show you the video. And then one of our county commissioners, big pro CAFO guy, he also went into the newspaper and told them if they didn't fire that reporter and quit covering this issue, that he would withdraw all the county public notices for the paper, which is one of the few things left. And if you go down to Northwest Iowa, those papers have basically had to start these nonprofit foundations, because if they cover any of the corporate agricultural pollution of the water, they lose all their funding. So it's a big threat, and we understand that about our local editor. We try to work with him.
And I mean, they succeeded, right? Didn't they get that reporter fired?
That reporter is no longer reporting.
Jeez. I mean, that is wild.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it sells papers. People are very interested in that issue, and they have been carefully trying to come back. But some of our other papers just don't even cover it.
And, Maeve, I wanted to bring you in here and get your thoughts on kind of the media coverage angle, and also just ask, like, from a personal standpoint, how much you had known or read about kind of this issue before. Like I know, speaking for myself, I think that when it first really hit my radar was a couple years ago. I think it was Hurricane Florence off the East Coast, where there were those images of these hog factories in North Carolina that had gotten flooded. And these horrifying stories of just thousands of pigs just being drowned, like in the cages that like Lisa was describing earlier. And then those massive lagoons of hog waste and placenta tissue just kind of overflowing with the rains. And then kind of just thinking about this really apocalyptic scene of people already battered by a hurricane in North Carolina, then having to face this kind of rushing onslaught, like a devil's stew of hog waste and carcasses kind of flowing through their towns. That was when it really kind of, I think, hit my radar in a way that made me really stop and think about it more. But I'm obviously looking at it in a very different light now that I'm involved in trying to bring coverage to this. So what about you? I guess, like, what's your own kind of relationship to this issue, and how do you think that what Free Speech TV does? How are y'all kind of working to fill those gaps that the corporate media and local media have when it comes to covering this issue?
Yeah, Max, great questions. I guess I'll start with my personal connection, which is very similar to yours. It was really when these big stories hit. My background prior to Free Speech TV was in community radio. So I've always been very aware about the need to have community-centric reporting, whether it's in urban or rural areas, and the deficit of these community voices. And we've heard from Hannah and Lisa as well, that chilling story of that reporter being fired, talking about how we're seeing these local newsrooms just being eviscerated, and the ones that are still standing are under enormous pressure because of how media ownership is structured, and they're beholden very often to their advertisers. So from a personal perspective, what did I know? I knew big ag was an issue. I knew consolidation of agriculture and particularly our food systems was an issue. But the impact on local communities in the way that was explored in this series, I didn't know. This hit me in a different way because hearing the voices of folks like Lisa and Forrest and the other people that we heard from in this series really hit me in a different way. That, okay, we're in an abstract way, we're connected to our food system, but most people in this country have no connection to our food system. So they might be eating bacon, with their breakfast, but they have no comprehension of where that has come from. And I think having stories like this, particularly the kind of reporting that Hannah did, and Max going out there with Conran and putting a camera in these communities that are largely ignored by national media, was so powerful. And that's why Free Speech TV was just delighted to be able to come in and help amplify some of these stories, because we know that these communities don't get their stories told, not on national news networks. We could do it because, like Real News Network, like in these times, we're a nonprofit. And Lisa touched on that when you have these news entities that are beholden to advertising dollars, who can essentially get a reporter fired because they're covering certain issues. I mean, really, the alternative is to have these nonprofit news structures in place. So to have this partnership between these three nonprofit news organizations, I think was really powerful. And I can talk a little bit about just the media landscape. There are so many changes to the media landscape that remind me of what's happening with food, the consolidation of ownership. So you've got these huge corporations controlling the voices. It's the same with food, the big ag, and what's happening there, consolidation of ownership. And I think there's so many reports on this, but I think one of the latest ones I've seen is that over the past 15 years, more than 1 in 5 newspapers have closed, and that's particularly in rural communities. And we're not seeing coverage from the national networks of these rural issues. We have seen what's happened in our political landscape, that there's a real divide. And I think so much of that is a lack of understanding, because we don't know what's happening in rural America. We don't know the issues. And there's a tendency, I think, on national entities to report on rural America as if it's a complete monolith. And so we don't get the nuance in reporting. We certainly don't hear about these kind of community activists and the activism that's happening in rural America. And so that's why I think this partnership has been so powerful. And from Free Speech TV's perspective, we're also trying to bring these voices to rural America because of the infrastructure challenges. Many folks in rural America don't have very adequate, say, internet. And so those streaming services, we're seeing so much news now being consumed through the internet, through the web. We're on Dish, and that actually has huge impact, I think, in rural areas. That's important for these rural communities to see their own experiences being reflected on a national network, but also because we're also in other areas, like on the East Coast and the West Coast, we have a huge amount of viewers. It's important that they also see these stories. And so I think we've been able to serve in a way that other national entities can't do because of what's happening in so many ways, particularly infrastructure. So anyway, that's a kind of a long-winded answer maybe to your question, but I was so excited because we really want to bring stories about rural America to the broader public, but we also recognize how important it is for rural communities to see those stories, their own stories being told in an authentic way. And that's what I think this whole series was able to do.
Hell yeah. No, I mean, that was not long-winded at all. I thought that was brilliant and just really speaks to, why Free Speech TV is such a vital institution and the reach that y'all have built over the years into those communities, especially those that have been left behind or underserved for a very long time, right, is super important, because I think everything that all of us have been talking about here shows how these things are interconnected, right? In order to understand the threat that these, factory farms pose, it really, in a lot of ways, is a battle over information. That battle has taken place at the community level, which Lisa and Forrest were both involved in, right? In researching and producing reports on the potential impacts of these things, getting that information to the community. Also, the kind of local media ecology. Are the newspapers covering it? Are those newspapers kind of being bankrolled by the very interests that don't want them to cover it? Where does national media fit into all of this, right? There is, I think, there's a knot of interlocked kind of questions wrapped up in this issue that, as you were saying, Maeve, like all of us should have a deep invested interest in understanding and untangling. And it's again, just really a testament to the kind of collaborative effort of everyone here and everyone involved, that we were able to bring some coverage to this. And I'm really, really proud of the work that we all did, which is by no means over, right? Obviously, we're talking here because this is an ongoing issue. And, people need to continue caring about this. We can't just learn about it, be horrified, then move on, right? For Lisa, for Forrest, for their neighbors, for everyone there, this issue has not gone away, right? And so we need to have a better ability to stay committed to these stories, seeing them through, keeping that pressure on, and making sure people stay informed. And so, kind of building off that, Forrest and Lisa, I wanted to actually ask y'all, you mentioned this a little bit in the beginning, but where do things stand now? Both like after that coverage came out, from the Real News, Free Speech TV, and in these times, and how have things developed since we were there talking to y'all in June?
Yeah, I guess before I hop into the updates of what's going on here, the nuance was mentioned. I think it's really important to capture that because, again, so much of this issue is so divisive and gets condensed down into these talking points of protect water or feed the world, and a lot of that nuance gets lost. So I think it is really important to recognize the pressures that farmers are under. We are in the middle of a farming crisis right now. It really hasn't ended since the 80s, and Southwest Wisconsin is one of the epicenters of that crisis. The milk pricing scheme that's been put in place has really hurt farmers in Wisconsin. And there's been this lie or myth promoted all the way back in Earl Butts's day in the 70s that you got to get big or get out if you're going to make any money. And Sonny Perdue was just here in Wisconsin a few years ago pitching the exact same line. And those who are being pushed into the CAFO production method, as Lisa calls it, the hog factories, meat factories, egg factories, milk factories, are being fed this line that, they need to have 10,000 animals if they want to send their kids to college, and that the international marketplace is what it is, and they just need to accept whatever price they're getting. So there's a lot of issues of food justice and fair prices for fair work that are all wrapped into this that need to be addressed, along with increased regulations, increased protections for water. We also need to be supporting our farmers. We want this area to continue producing food, but that can't come at the cost of our resources, and it needs to be in a fair and just economy and have a more realistic definition of what efficient is, because when they say they're efficient, they're only talking about production per acre of one commodity. And that's not real efficiency. And that efficiency is also based on a whole host of negative externalities, as they call it in macroeconomics. And when I say negative externalities, I mean people's health, people's safety, the quality of our water, the quality of our air. Big corporations are masters at externalizing these negative impacts so they can make as much profit as possible. Whereas if you take a more holistic view of things, and here I live on a permaculture cooperative, I eat meat, I eat pork, we raise pigs here. I love my pigs, and I love so many of the results that they have on this landscape. We integrate them into our system in multiple ways so that they're not just machines that are producing pork. They're our friends. They till up the soil and help us plant in things behind that. They give us nutrients and fertilizer. And, we talk about manure as a problem, but it is an important nutrient. Animals are important on the landscape. Manure can be black gold, but it becomes a problem when we concentrate it in these giant multi-million gallon manure lagoons of liquid manure that's mostly water. And then you have to spread it all in these two short windows that Lisa mentioned, in the spring and the fall, assuming you have decent weather, which is becoming ever less predictable. And then it becomes a problem, right? It's the industrialization, the concentration, the consolidation that's making totally natural processes into problems in our communities. So as for our local situation and where we're at now, as I mentioned before, we're kind of in a waiting game at this very moment, waiting to see what the DNR responds to all the public input that they've received. Over 100 people showed up at the public hearing for the Roth Feeder Pig 2 CAFO expansion. 28 people spoke. Only one person spoke up in favor of the operation, and that was the owner-operator of Roth Feeder Pig, he was recently the president of the National Pork Producers Association and one of the main spokespeople for the industry, asking the federal government for bailout money to save the industry, which once again isn't really efficient if it can't adapt to changing circumstances and predictable crises like pandemics, which CAFOs are a major breeding ground for all sorts of pathogens and probably the most likely source of the future pandemics that are to come and the sources of past pandemics that we've had. And so we're waiting on the DNR to see what they say. There's been a recent Wisconsin Supreme Court decision that clarified the DNR's authority to implement basic conditions to protect groundwater and surface water quality, such as capping the animal level, the animal units, or putting in groundwater monitoring wells. So we're really hoping for some of these conditions. We're really hoping for some of the science to come through. In the meantime, we are asking our elected representatives to urge the DNR to do this. We're urging the DNR and the governor and lieutenant governor to really follow through on their commitments to prioritize clean water and really have a serious DNR that focuses on protecting the environment. And Wisconsin's DNR used to be a model for the nation of a real serious and protective DNR. And now I have people who joke about them being the does not respond agency, and they deal over and over again. They're well-intentioned people working in the DNR. I don't think they're trying to, cover things up or obfuscate, but they're dealing with budget shortfalls and staff shortages, constantly and are not really able to do their job. And that's the work of our elected representatives to fix that problem.
Well, I think if you are looking for an update from Polk County, I'd say that we have garnered the attention of Big Ag, and our town in particular is a town of maybe 900 people. So what we did is we got involved in electoral politics and elected 2 new town board people. So our town is run by a three-member board, and we got 2 of them elected with 60% of the vote. So we basically took over the town. And so we are moving forward on passing a strong ordinance that not only looks at manure management, but looks at air quality and some of the other things that the existing laws don't do. And it's kind of funny. I just have to mention that they're bringing their big lawyers to our meetings now. We have a lawyer named Lane Ruland, who used to be the work in the Attorney General's office here in Wisconsin, but she's most famous because she was Kanye West's lawyer last year when he tried to get on the Wisconsin presidential ballot. And he hired her to collect a bunch of petitions and deliver them and get him on the ballot. And she collected the petitions, but got to the Election Commission office 3 minutes late, and they wouldn't let her submit the petitions. So for some reason, they've brought Lane Ruland's wrath down on us here in Lake Town. But what we are working for is very local control, because the last thing these guys want is thousands of county and township politicians serving their people. They want to push this all up to the state level because they've already bought off the legislature in Wisconsin. So that's where they want the action to be. And so what we're seeing our pro-CAFO county commissioners doing, they say, oh, it's the state's responsibility. We can't do it. We can't do it. And so our strategy is that we're going to protect ourselves at the local level. And we are in the process of developing an ordinance that we hope will stand up to legal people trying to sue us on it. And we're hoping that Lane Ruland doesn't show up here again. That's our real hope.
I really admire the work that's being done up there in Polk and Burnett counties, and I think that's exactly what needs to be done in all of our rural communities, where we can't just sit back and complain and criticize about the decisions being made, but we need to show up at our local municipal, whether that's village or township or city meetings, and listen to what's going on, take part, and just be involved, because it's easy to sit back and criticize the decisions that are being made when we have no idea how those are made. And I got on my local township planning commission just by attending 3 consecutive meetings, and I barely said anything. And now I'm in a position where I can have a little bit more of a voice. And I think that's a really important thing that anyone can do, and anyone can get involved on that level.
Oh yeah. No, I think, I certainly was very inspired to kind of see the efforts that you, that Lisa, that so many others in the community have been, marshaling against this, right? Because I think that is something that so many of us have lost over the decades, right? Just this very notion that, we have a stake in shaping the world that we live in, and the and the communities that we live in, the way that businesses run, right? The protections for the environment that we all depend on, right? The kinds of ordinances that are passed. Like, there's so much territory that impacts our lives that I think so many of us have just kind of said, okay, well, that's left up to the politicians, right? I'll weigh in like every couple of years, and then I'll complain about the decisions that they make. But I think so many of us need to retrain ourselves to have those muscles and to have that kind of fight and commitment and belief that we can actually, together with our neighbors, with our coworkers, make a difference. And I think that, if anything, if folks watch the coverage that we did in collaboration with In These Times and Free Speech TV on this struggle, what you're going to see is everyday people saying we're not going to take this anymore and doing what they can to fight against it. And I think that, that's something that all of us around the country and beyond can really take to heart. And, I can't thank y'all enough for, taking the time to sit down with me and really give, I think, a lot of great and helpful information and context for listeners as we prepare to kind of run some of the audio interviews of our CAFO coverage on the Working People feed. I think that this is really an important discussion for everyone who watched our reports or everyone who's just hearing about it now to understand, what's going on with these CAFO fights in Wisconsin, why they're important and why we should care. And in the remaining minutes before I let everybody go, because I don't want to keep y'all too long, I was wondering if we could kind of go around the table one more time and just maybe mention like one aspect to this story that, we really want listeners to understand, or really take to heart, right? Because we've thrown a lot at them. As we said before, there are a lot of interlocking kind of issues. The issue of government control at the local and state level, the issue of media coverage and how corporate interests have kind of, got their fingers into that. The obvious issue of factory farming and industrial agriculture and what it does to the environment, what it does to people's health and property values and the animals involved. So there are a lot of aspects here that are really important. And I wanted to maybe just kind of go around the table and ask y'all, like, if you could kind of highlight one for listeners who are maybe just hearing about this now, what do you think that would be? And then also for Lisa and Forrest, I was wondering if you could also say a word or two about what people listening can do to show support for you, your neighbors, and the struggles going on in your counties.
I think the aspect that I would really want to highlight for people is the labor issue and what this is really about in terms of an economic issue. You're going to hear from these corporate agriculture guys that the only way to grow food is in factories, and these doggone lazy Americans don't want to do real work, and they won't work in these factories. So we have to bring in immigrant slave labor from other countries to run our factories. And, slave labor is the bedrock of capitalism. We all know that. But I want you to know that there's a middle-class farm economy that has been nurturing farmers, for 100 years. And in the last 50 years, there's been a really concerted effort by corporate agriculture to destroy that middle class. And that the economic issue is really front and center for us. And we're fighting for our livelihoods right now. And that our families were immigrants. We were brought in here to destroy all the cut down all the trees and send them off to Weyerhaeuser so they could build Chicago and Minneapolis. And we recognize that colonial history is definitely part of our heritage here. But at the same time, we're trying to hold on to this middle class economy that has survived in spite of the onslaught from corporate globalism, which is a whole nother topic we didn't talk about. So what can you do? I think the number one thing you can do at this point is buy local, eat local whenever possible, find out where your meat's from. And then Senator Cory Booker and Representative Ro Khanna have some really great new bill that they're coming out with called the Farm System Reform Act. And bug your politicians to support that. This is a very bipartisan issue. Both the Democrats and the Republicans have been carrying the water for corporate ag for 50 years. So whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, get a hold of your politicians and ask them to support this work that Senator Cory Booker is doing in Washington that would really just attempt to dismantle the monopoly grip that corporate America has on the farm economy and look at finding a new way to move forward that would be profitable for the middle class, not just the ruling class.
Yeah, and I'll echo a lot of what Lisa said there, just the importance of understanding that corporate colonization of our communities, and how, that's been what this country and corporations have been doing across the world for many years, and just how this country was founded, and understanding those dynamics is really critical. And we focused a lot on sort of what I call sometimes the box of allowable remedies, where you ask the elected representatives and you sign the petitions and you have moratoriums, and all those things are important. It's really important to be practicing those active steps in what's left of our democracy. But also, echoing what Lisa said, the direct action is probably the most important and effective things that we can do. Growing our own food, knowing exactly where our food comes from, and deciding consciously what to be buying and how it's produced has huge impacts where those industries are located. And these dynamics are going on not only in food and farming, as was mentioned, it's happening in media, it's happening really in all parts of the economy, but it's perhaps most unacceptable and inappropriate for the food system. The food system is not supposed to be a linear extractive system. It needs to be this cyclical system where inputs and outputs are balanced, and it's all about relationship and our relationship with the water, with the land. And if we can be conscious about those relationships and move away from extractive and polluting relationships with our food, with our local economy, with our neighbors, that will help the system, and that will shift the system to something that is more sustainable and is more resilient.
Exactly what Lisa and Forrest have said about the connection with labor and agriculture. We are all connected to that. But just to go back to the media entity of this, we're seeing the same dynamics as we've heard with consolidation of ownership. And this series was only possible because of the collaboration between nonprofit media entities. And so I always encourage people, no matter where you are, find out what nonprofit media looks like in your community. Maybe there's a community radio station, maybe there's the local independent paper, maybe there's some media outlet that really has at its core elevating these voices, and they need your support. And I think we often just check out and say, well, I can just watch, commercial TV or listen to commercial radio. That has a cost, because when you look at or listen to or see the amount of advertising that is connected to big ag, that is connected to these corporations that are controlling so much of our lives, that's what you're exposing yourself to on these commercial entities. So I guess I would encourage people to be discerning consumers of media in much the same way that we're also hearing that they need to be discerning consumers of food as well, because that consumption has impact. And so I teach media to students. They always say, who are the voices you're not hearing? Who are the voices that are being deliberately excluded? And often it's folks like Lisa and Forrest who aren't getting heard in big commercial corporate media centric stories. And so support nonprofit media, whatever that looks like in your community.
Oh man. Everyone said some really great, obviously very, very crucial things. All I can think to add to it is, I guess, just kind of remembering giving a sense of scope to it, right? For listeners who aren't in these affected communities or in cities, it's very easy to dismiss this as, it's just a rural issue, or it's just a Polk or Crawford issue. And I really just think it's important to push back against this, not only because, as we've discussed, this is a statewide issue with CAFOs around the state. It is a nationwide and global issue. It's happening in Iowa. It's happening in North Carolina, in California. And adding on to that, especially in regard to hog CAFOs in Wisconsin, it's not just the proposed CAFO and that's it, right? It's a foot in the door. As we've seen with similar industry and just industry in general at this scale, it is not enough to just put one factory one place, right? The goal is to expand and keep growing and keep encroaching and keep eating up resources. In regard to the lack of community control that we have seen in Polk, Crawford, and Burnett, I just want to stress that the same forces at play that are making it so difficult for the residents of these counties to stop a CAFO, and it is clearly overwhelmingly against that coming in. The same forces in play that are inhibiting people from doing that are the same forces that are allowing Amazon warehouses to come into Chicago neighborhoods despite majority community opposition. And just wanting to draw those connections, I think, is the thing I'd want to go out on.